We've been married for months, but he's never once touched me. No kiss, no embrace, nothing. And when I asked why, his answer cut deeper than silence. My body is my choice. I thought I married the man of my dreams, but little did I know he was hiding a secret so dark it would turn my entire marriage into a trap. Before I share what I uncovered, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if your husband or wife refused all intimacy after marriage? Share your opinion in the comments, and while you're at it, don't forget to hit subscribe to Revenge with Nick so you never miss more stories like this. My name is Linda, and I thought I had it all figured out. At 28, I was marrying Michael, the man I'd been dreaming about since our first coffee date 2 years earlier. He was 33, successful in his accounting firm, and had this way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the room. When he proposed on a quiet beach in Maine, with the lighthouse casting shadows across the sand, I didn't hesitate for a second. Our wedding wasn't one of those Instagram-perfect affairs you see everywhere. We kept it intimate, about 60 people at a small vineyard in upstate New York. My mom cried during the ceremony, which made me cry, which made Michael's eyes water too. I can still smell the lavender from my bouquet and hear the string quartet playing our song, At Last, by Etta James. You may kiss the bride, the officiant said, and when Michael's lips touched mine, I felt like everything in my life had finally clicked into place. The applause around us felt distant, like we were in our own perfect bubble. But bubbles have a way of bursting when you least expect them. Our honeymoon was supposed to be 2 weeks in Italy, Rome, Florence, the Amalfi Coast. I'd planned everything down to the restaurant reservations and the little notebook where I'd written down Italian phrases. Ti amo, I'd practiced saying, I love you. The first red flag should have been obvious, but when you're in love, you make excuses for everything. On our wedding night, at the beautiful bed and breakfast we'd booked, I slipped into the silk negligee I'd bought months earlier. The room smelled like vanilla candles and fresh roses. I expected, well, what any new bride expects. Instead, Michael sat on the edge of the bed, still in his dress shirt, scrolling through his phone. Honey, I whispered, moving closer to him. It's our wedding night. He looked up, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt? Fear? I couldn't tell. Then he smiled, that same charming smile that had won me over years ago. I'm exhausted, Linda. It's been such a long day. Can we just hold each other tonight? I told myself it was sweet. Romantic, even. Not every man was obsessed with sex, right? Some preferred emotional intimacy. I curled up next to him, listening to his heartbeat, convincing myself this was better than anything physical could be. But the next night was the same. And the night after that. I don't feel well, he'd say, pressing his hand to his forehead. I think I might be coming down with something. Or, I'm still tired from the wedding planning. You know how stressful it all was. By our 5th day in Rome, when I suggested we skip the Colosseum tour and spend the morning in bed together, he actually recoiled. Actually pulled away from me like I'd suggested something disgusting. My body, my choice, Linda, he said, and those 4 words hit me like ice water. You can't demand intimacy from me. I stared at him, standing there in our beautiful hotel room overlooking the Tiber River, and felt something crack inside my chest. He was right, of course. Consent worked both ways. But the way he said it, cold, distant, like I was some stranger harassing him on the street, that wasn't the man I'd married. I wasn't demanding anything, I whispered. I just thought, we're newlyweds, Michael. This is supposed to be special. He softened slightly, reached out to touch my shoulder. It is special. We don't need sex to prove our love, do we? I wanted to say yes, actually, sometimes we did. I wanted to tell him that I'd been looking forward to this part of marriage, that physical intimacy mattered to me. Instead, I nodded and suggested we get gelato. The rest of our honeymoon passed in a blur of tourist attractions and polite conversation. We took beautiful photos, me leaning against his shoulder at the Trevi Fountain, both of us smiling at sunset in Positano. To anyone looking at those pictures, we were the perfect couple. But at night, when we'd return to our romantic hotel rooms, Michael would find reasons to stay busy until I fell asleep. I started wondering if something was wrong with me. Had I gained weight without noticing? Was my perfume too strong? Did I have bad breath? I became hyper-aware of every little thing about myself, checking mirrors constantly, brushing my teeth 3 times a day. When we returned home to our apartment in Brooklyn, I thought things would change. New environment, less travel stress, back to our normal routine. I cooked his favorite dinner, beef stroganoff with those egg noodles he loved, and wore the green dress that he'd once said made my eyes look like emeralds. Nothing. He thanked me for dinner, helped with the dishes, then settled onto the couch with his laptop. When I sat next to him, he didn't even look up from his screen. "How was work today?" I asked, trying to start a conversation that might lead somewhere more intimate. "Fine," he mumbled, clicking through spreadsheets. "Peterson wants the quarterly report by Friday." I put my hand on his thigh, just a gentle touch, and he shifted away. Not dramatically, just enough that my hand fell onto the couch cushion instead. That night, I bought lingerie online. Not the sweet, romantic kind, the kind that left nothing to the imagination. When it arrived, I waited until Michael got home from work, then emerged from the bathroom like some sort of desperate housewife fantasy. He glanced up from his phone, blinked twice, then looked back at his screen. "I need to finish some emails," he said. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds, feeling more naked and exposed than I'd ever felt in my life. Then I went back to the bathroom, put on my pajamas, and cried quietly into a towel so he wouldn't hear. My friends didn't help. "Give him time," my best friend Sarah said when I finally worked up the courage to mention that our honeymoon had been different than expected. Men handle the transition to marriage differently than women do. "He's probably just processing all the changes." My mom was even worse. "Honey, physical intimacy isn't everything in a marriage. Maybe he's showing his love in other ways. Does he still bring you flowers? Does he tell you he loves you?" He did, actually. Every morning before work, Michael would kiss my forehead and say, "Love you, babe." He'd bring home my favorite coffee on Sundays. He'd text me throughout the day with little updates about his meetings or funny memes he'd found. In every way except the one that mattered most to me, he was still the perfect husband. But late at night, when he'd fall asleep facing away from me, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Imagine you just married the love of your life, and they suddenly refuse all affection. What would you think was happening? Comment your first guess. I'm curious to see your answers. And hey, if you're finding the story as confusing as I found my situation, maybe hit that subscribe button. I share stories like this every day, and trust me, you don't want to miss any. 3 months into our marriage, I became an expert at pretending everything was fine. "How's married life?" people would ask at grocery stores, at work, at family gatherings. I'd flash them my biggest smile and say, "Wonderful. I'm so lucky." Then I'd change the subject before anyone could ask follow-up questions. Social media became my biggest lie. I'd post pictures of Michael and me at restaurants, at parks, cuddled up on the couch watching movies. "My amazing husband surprised me with brunch today." #blessed, #married life, #soulmate. The comments would pour in, heart emojis, couple goals, "You two are perfect together." If only they knew that the cuddled up on the couch photo was staged. That I'd asked Michael to sit close to me just long enough for the picture, and he'd immediately moved his usual spot on the other end afterward. I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The way he'd shower immediately after getting home from work, like he was washing something off. How he'd started sleeping on the very edge of our bed, leaving a canyon of space between us. The way he'd tense up if I accidentally brushed against him while reaching for something in the kitchen. But it was the way he looked at me sometimes that really got to me. I'd catch him staring when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and his expression was strange. Not love, not desire, not even friendship. It was guilt mixed with pity, like he was looking at a wounded animal he couldn't bring himself to put out of its misery. "Are you okay?" I asked one Saturday morning, finding him standing at our kitchen window, staring out at nothing with that same expression. He startled, like I'd caught him doing something wrong. "Of course. Why? You seem distant lately." "More than usual, I mean." Michael poured himself another cup of coffee, keeping his back to me. "Work has been stressful." End of quarter, you know. It was March. The quarter had ended 2 weeks ago. Maybe we should plan a weekend away, I suggested, trying to keep my voice light. Remember that little cabin in the Catskills we looked at online? We could rent it for a couple days, disconnect from everything. The coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. I don't think that's a good idea right now. With everything going on at the office. When then? The words came out sharper than I intended. When will it ever be a good idea, Michael? Because it's been 3 months since our wedding, and you've had an excuse every single time I've suggested we do anything together. Just the two of us. He turned around then, and for a second, I thought he might actually tell me the truth. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I'm sorry, he said finally. You're right. Let me check my calendar. But he never did check his calendar. And I never brought up the cabin again. The loneliness was the worst part. I'd wake up next to my husband every morning and feel completely alone. I started taking longer routes home from work just to delay coming back to our apartment. I'd wander through bookstores, sit in coffee shops reading magazines I didn't care about, anything to avoid the polite distance waiting for me at home. I began keeping a journal, hidden in my dresser drawer under my winter sweaters. At first, it was just mundane stuff. What I ate for lunch, what shows I watched, complaints about my coworkers. But gradually, it became my only honest space. Day 97 of marriage, I wrote one night. Michael worked late again. Came home with Chinese takeout and ate it while answering emails. I tried to start a conversation about the weird noise our refrigerator has been making, and he just nodded without looking up. I feel invisible. Is this what the rest of my life is going to look like? Then, a week later, saw a couple at the park today holding hands and laughing. Tried to remember the last time Michael and I laughed together. Actually laughed, not just polite chuckles. Can't remember. And then, starting to wonder if he ever loved me at all, or if I was just convenient. Safe. The kind of woman you marry because you're supposed to get married, not because you actually want to be with her. The breaking point came in May, 4 months after our wedding. I was doing laundry. Michael's dress shirts needed to be dry cleaned, but I always checked the pockets first for receipts or pens. In the jacket he'd worn to work the previous Tuesday, I found something that made my hands shake. Hotel receipts. 3 of them, from 3 different hotels in Manhattan. All within the past month. All for single rooms, booked from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. My mind raced through possibilities. Business meetings? Client dinners that ran late? Maybe his company was putting him up for afternoon conferences? But why hadn't he mentioned any of this? And why were the rooms booked for such specific time blocks? 2 to 6 p.m. wasn't a normal business meeting time. It was the kind of timing that suggested other activities. I sat on our bedroom floor, holding those receipts like they were radioactive, and felt my marriage crumble around me. This was it. This was why he wouldn't touch me. There was someone else. When Michael came home that evening, I was waiting in the kitchen with the receipts spread out on the counter like evidence in a crime scene. What are these? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. He looked at the receipts, then at me, then back at the receipts. That same guilty expression crossed his face, but this time it was stronger. More desperate. Business meetings, he said quickly. With Peterson. We've been working on a big client presentation and needed somewhere quiet to focus. Peterson? I picked up one of the receipts. The Waldorf Astoria is where you go for quiet business meetings? Look, Linda, you're overthinking this. Am I? I stood up, and something in my movement must have alarmed him because he took a step back. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my husband is booking hotel rooms in the middle of the day and not telling me about it. And considering that same husband hasn't touched me once since our wedding night, I think I'm actually underthinking this. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could hear our upstairs neighbor's TV, a car alarm going off down the street, the hum of our refrigerator with its weird noise that he'd never bothered to listen to. My body, my choice, he said finally, quietly. You can't demand explanations about what I do with my time. It was the same phrase he'd used in Rome, but this time it felt different. Like a weapon. You're absolutely right, I said, surprising both of us with how calm I sounded. Your body, your choice. Your time, your choice. Your secrets, your choice. But Michael? My marriage is my choice too. And I'm starting to wonder if I made the wrong one. He looked like I'd slapped him. Linda, please. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. Another silence. Longer this time. I can't. Those two words hung in the air between us like a confession. Not, there's nothing to tell, or you're being crazy. Just I can't. Which meant there was definitely something to tell. He just wasn't going to tell me. That night, I slept in our guest room for the first time since we got married. I told myself it was temporary, just until we could have a real conversation. But as I lay in that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling in a room that smelled like dust and mothballs instead of his cologne, I wondered if this was just the beginning of the end. If your spouse avoided intimacy for months, would you confront them directly or secretly investigate? Tell me in the comments, because I had to make a choice here, and honestly, if you're experiencing something similar, maybe my story can help you figure out your next step. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. Stories like these take a lot to share, and knowing you're listening makes it worth it. I became a detective in my own marriage. It started small. I'd pay attention to when Michael's phone rang and watch his face when he answered. I'd listen to his side of conversations from the other room, trying to piece together clues from fragments like, "not tonight," and "same time Thursday." His phone became his most guarded possession. He'd take it with him to the bathroom, keep it face down during dinner, sleep with it on his nightstand instead of the charging station we'd set up in the kitchen. When it buzzed with texts, he'd check them immediately, his fingers flying across the screen with responses he'd delete and retype multiple times. One evening, while he was in the shower, his phone rang from the bedroom. Without thinking, I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. By the time Michael came out, hair still damp and smelling like his cedar-scented body wash, the phone had stopped ringing. But it started again an hour later. And then again at 11 p.m., when we were supposedly getting ready for bed. "Aren't you going to answer that?" I asked. "Probably a spam call," he said, but I noticed he'd moved the phone closer to himself. I started checking our phone records online. Michael had added me as an authorized user on all our accounts when we got married, back when we were still pretending to be a team. The detailed billing showed me everything I needed to know and nothing I wanted to see. Late-night calls to the same number, sometimes lasting an hour or more. Calls during his lunch break. Calls on weekends when he'd claim he was running errands and come home with nothing to show for it. I wrote the number down and stared at it for days, debating whether to call. What would I say? "Hi, you don't know me, but I think you might be sleeping with my husband." What if it really was a business contact? What if I was losing my mind? But then I found the credit card statements. Michael had always handled our finances. "I'm good with numbers," he'd said when we moved in together, and I'd been happy to let him take care of the bills and budgets. Now I realized that might have been a mistake. Hidden among the usual expenses, groceries, gas, utilities, were charges I didn't recognize. A restaurant in Midtown where we'd never eaten together. Parking garage fees in parts of Manhattan I'd never been to. And more hotel charges, always during business hours, always for just a few hours at a time. My hands shook as I scrolled through months of statements. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Every Tuesday and Thursday, like clockwork. Sometimes more frequently during busy weeks at his office. The worst part wasn't even the deception. It was the planning. This wasn't some impulsive mistake or a moment of weakness. This was methodical. Scheduled. He was living a double life with the same attention to detail he brought to his accounting spreadsheets. I decided to follow him. The thought made me sick with shame even as I planned it. What kind of person spies on their spouse? What kind of marriage had we built that I felt like I needed to hire a private investigator, like some character in a bad movie? But I couldn't confront him with circumstantial evidence again. I needed proof. Something definitive that he couldn't dismiss with vague excuses about business meetings and stress. On a Thursday in late June, I called in sick to work and waited in my car outside Michael's office building. The morning sun glinted off the glass facade, and I felt like I was in someone else's life. Like I was watching a movie about a woman whose marriage was falling apart instead of actually living it. Michael emerged at exactly 1:30 p.m., checking his phone as he walked. He looked good. He always looked good. His dark blue suit was perfectly tailored, his hair still thick and wavy despite his age. Other women on the sidewalk noticed him, and I felt a familiar stab of pride mixed with jealousy. This handsome, successful man was my husband. So why didn't he want me? I followed his taxi through Manhattan traffic, staying far enough back to avoid being seen, but close enough to track where he was going. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Part of me hoped he really was going to some legitimate business meeting, that I'd waste an afternoon sitting outside an office building and feel foolish but relieved. The taxi stopped at the Marriott in Times Square. I watched Michael pay the driver and walk through the revolving door like he'd done it 100 times before. Confident. Familiar. This wasn't his first visit. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, debating what to do next. I could go home, pretend I'd never followed him, continue living in willful ignorance. Or I could walk into that lobby and see who he was meeting. The lobby was crowded with tourists and business travelers. I found a seat near the elevators with a clear view of the check-in desk and waited. Michael was nowhere to be seen, presumably already upstairs with whoever he was meeting. At 4:30 p.m., the elevator dinged and Michael stepped out. But he wasn't alone. The man with him was older, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and expensive clothes. They were talking in low voices, and the older man's hand was on Michael's shoulder in a gesture that seemed both paternal and intimate. As I watched, frozen in my lobby chair, the man handed Michael an envelope and squeezed his arm. They didn't kiss. They didn't hold hands. There was nothing overtly romantic about their interaction. But there was something significant. Important. The way they looked at each other, the careful way they said goodbye. This wasn't a business relationship. Michael left through the front entrance, while the older man went toward the hotel restaurant. I followed the older man, keeping my distance, and watched him sit alone at a corner table and order what looked like a scotch. He seemed tired. Sad, even. This wasn't what I'd expected to find. In my darkest imaginings, I'd pictured Michael with another woman, younger, prettier, more exciting than me. Someone who could give him whatever I apparently couldn't. But this was something else entirely. I drove home in a daze, arriving before Michael as usual. When he walked through our door at 6:45 p.m., I was cooking dinner and pretending to watch the news, just like any other Thursday. How was work? I asked, the same question I asked every day. Fine, he said, the same answer he gave every day. Peterson's being demanding about the quarterly projections, but we'll figure it out. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my spatula at his lying face and demand the truth. Instead, I nodded and asked if he wanted rice or pasta with the chicken. That weekend, I made a decision that felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. I hired a private investigator. Sarah thought I'd lost my mind. Linda, honey, if you're that suspicious of Michael, maybe you should just leave him. Do you really want to be married to someone you trust so little that you need to hire a stranger to spy on him? But I couldn't leave without knowing the truth. And I couldn't live with the uncertainty that was eating me alive from the inside. The private investigator's name was Rebecca, and she had kind eyes and a firm handshake. Her office was small and cluttered with case files, but something about her no-nonsense attitude made me feel like I wasn't completely crazy. Tell me what you've observed, she said, pulling out a legal pad. I told her everything. The lack of intimacy, the hotel receipts, the phone calls, the afternoon meetings. As I talked, she took notes without judgment, asking occasional questions for clarification. What outcome are you hoping for? She asked when I finished. I thought about it. I want to know who my husband really is. Because the man I married 8 months ago isn't the man I'm living with now, and I need to understand what changed. And if what I find isn't what you expect, if it's worse than an affair, or better than an affair, or just completely different from anything you've imagined, then at least I'll know the truth. And I can decide what to do with it. Rebecca nodded. I'll start with surveillance and background research. Give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I went through the motions of normal life, work, errands, dinners with Michael where we discussed nothing important. But underneath, I was counting down the days until I'd finally have answers. At this point, what do you think Michael is hiding? Drop your theories below. Some of you might actually guess the shocking truth. And if you're invested in finding out what Rebecca discovered, subscribing really helps me continue sharing these kinds of deep, personal stories. Trust me, what she found changed everything. Rebecca called me at work on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later. Her voice was professional but gentler than usual. "Linda, I have the information you requested. Can you meet me at my office this afternoon?" This isn't the kind of conversation to have over the phone. The afternoon stretched endlessly. I told my boss I had a dentist appointment and left work early, my stomach churning with anticipation and dread. What could be so serious that Rebecca couldn't just tell me Michael was having an affair? Part of me had started hoping that's all it was, something straightforward and terrible but understandable. Rebecca's office felt different this time. Smaller somehow. More oppressive. She gestured for me to sit across from her desk, where a manila folder sat closed between us like a weapon. "Before I show you what I found," she said, "I want you to know that your instincts were right. Michael is hiding something significant from you. But it's not what either of us expected." She opened the folder and pulled out several photographs. The first showed Michael entering the Marriott hotel I'd seen him visit. The second showed him with the older man I'd noticed, but this time, I could see the man's face clearly. He was distinguished looking, with kind eyes and an expensive suit. "This is Dr. Martin Hendricks," Rebecca said. "He's a specialist in genetic medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital. Specifically, he works with patients who have Huntington's disease." The words hit me like ice water. Huntington's disease. I knew that name from a movie I'd seen years ago, something about a family torn apart by a hereditary condition that destroyed the brain and body slowly, inevitably. "Michael's been seeing Dr. Hendricks twice a week for the past 6 months," Rebecca continued, pulling out more documents. "He started treatment shortly after your engagement." My hands were shaking as I reached for the medical records she'd somehow obtained. Michael's name was at the top, along with test results and treatment notes I couldn't understand. But I could understand the diagnosis, written in clinical black and white. Huntington's disease, early stage. "How did you get these?" I whispered. "Dr. Hendricks has been treating Michael pro bono," Rebecca explained. "Michael's father died of the same condition when Michael was in college. He's been living with the knowledge that he had a 50% chance of inheriting it and apparently decided to get tested after you two got engaged." The room felt like it was spinning. Michael's father had died when he was 22, I knew that. But Michael had always said it was a heart attack. Quick, unexpected, nothing hereditary to worry about. Another lie in a marriage built on lies. "The hotel meetings," I said slowly, trying to piece it together. "Dr. Hendricks has been counseling Michael through the implications of his diagnosis. They meet outside the hospital to avoid insurance complications and because Michael specifically requested complete discretion." Rebecca's voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "The early stages of Huntington's can affect intimate relationships, physical coordination, emotional regulation, impulse control. Michael has been struggling with symptoms he doesn't want you to see." I thought about all those times he'd pulled away from my touch, all those nights he'd slept on the edge of the bed, all those moments when he'd looked at me with that expression I couldn't identify. It hadn't been guilt about cheating, it had been guilt about hiding a terminal illness from his wife. "Is he?" I couldn't finish the question. "Huntington's is progressive," Rebecca said carefully. "The timeline varies, but most patients have 10 to 20 years from diagnosis to the end stages. Michael's test results suggest he's in the very early phases, but the psychological impact of knowing what's coming can be as devastating as the physical symptoms." I stared at the photographs of my husband meeting with his doctor, and everything fell into place with horrible clarity. The vitamin bottles he'd tried to hide in his nightstand drawer. The way he'd started avoiding mirrors. The exhaustion he'd blamed on work stress. The way he'd sometimes stop mid-sentence and look confused, as if he'd forgotten what he was saying. "There's something else," Rebecca said quietly. She pulled out a document that looked like legal paperwork. "Michael has been meeting with an attorney as well. He's been trying to figure out how to divorce you without you finding out about his condition." The betrayal hit me harder than the diagnosis. "What?" "He's been researching no-fault divorce procedures. Clean break, minimal explanations required. From what I could gather, his plan was to become increasingly distant until you decided to leave him yourself. He thought it would be kinder than telling you the truth. I wanted to laugh at the insanity of it, but instead, I started crying. Ugly, angry tears that I couldn't control. My husband was dying of a horrible disease, and his response was to shut me out completely and plan to abandon me rather than let me support him through it. The man he loves enough to protect from this is himself, I said through my tears. Not me. Rebecca handed me a box of tissues and waited while I tried to compose myself. When I finally looked up, she was watching me with the kind of expression you'd give someone whose house had just burned down. What do I do now? I asked. That depends on what kind of person you want to be, she said. And what kind of marriage you want to have. I drove home with the folder of evidence on my passenger seat, feeling like I was carrying explosives. Every red light gave me time to think about the man I'd married versus the man who was probably already home, making small talk about his fake day at work while hiding a devastating secret. Michael was in the kitchen when I walked in, stirring pasta sauce and humming quietly to himself. He looked so normal, so much like the man I'd fallen in love with, that for a moment I could pretend nothing had changed. How was work? He asked without looking up. The question that had become meaningless over the past months suddenly felt like a slap in the face. How was work? How was work for the woman whose husband was dying and planning to leave her rather than trust her with the truth? It was interesting, I said carefully. I learned some things I didn't expect to learn. He glanced at me then, and I saw him register something different in my tone. His stirring slowed. Oh? Like what? I pulled out one of the photographs Rebecca had given me, the one of him entering the Marriott with Dr. Hendricks. Like the fact that my husband has been lying to me for months about where he spends his afternoons. The wooden spoon clattered into the sauce pot. Michael's face went completely white, then flushed red, then white again. He gripped the counter like he was about to fall down. Linda, I can explain. Can you? I set the folder on the kitchen table and sat down heavily. Because I have medical records that say you're dying, legal documents that say you're planning to divorce me, and photographs that prove you've been lying about everything for our entire marriage. So please explain. Help me understand why my husband would rather plan to leave me than trust me with the truth. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. Finally, Michael turned off the stove and sat down across from me. When he looked up, his eyes were full of tears. I didn't want this to be your life, he said quietly. What life? Being married to someone I love who's going through something difficult. Being married to someone who's going to forget your name. Someone who's going to lose control of his body and his mind and become a burden you never signed up for. His voice broke on the last word. You're 28 years old, Linda. You should have a husband who can give you children and grow old with you and dance at your 50th anniversary. Not someone who's going to spend the next 15 years slowly disappearing. I looked at this man I'd promised to love in sickness and in health and felt a rage so pure it surprised me. So you decided for both of us, I said. You decided that I couldn't handle the truth, that I wouldn't want to stay, that I was too weak or too selfish to love you through this. You decided to make yourself a martyr instead of making me a partner. Linda. No. I stood up and the chair scraped against the floor like a scream. You don't get to Linda me anymore. You gave up that right when you decided our marriage vows were suggestions instead of promises. When you chose to protect yourself from vulnerability instead of trusting me with your heart. He was crying openly now, ugly sobs that shook his whole body. I'm so scared, he whispered. I'm so fucking scared, and I didn't know how to tell you that your husband is already starting to die. And there it was. The truth, finally. Raw and terrible and real. I walked around the table and knelt next to his chair. When I put my hands on his face, he leaned into the touch like a man dying of thirst. You should have told me, I said, my own tears falling onto his cheeks. You should have trusted me enough to tell me. Do you think I should forgive Michael for hiding this, or is the secrecy itself a betrayal? Share your thoughts. I want to see how divided the opinions are. And if you're emotionally invested in how this story ends, subscribing helps me know these deeply personal stories matter to you. Because what happened next changed both of us forever. I didn't sleep that night. Michael and I had talked until 3 a.m, really talked, maybe for the first time in our entire relationship. He told me about the symptoms he'd been hiding, the muscle twitches he'd blamed on too much caffeine, the moments of confusion he'd dismissed as stress, the growing clumsiness that made him afraid to touch me because he might hurt me accidentally. He told me about watching his father deteriorate when he was in college, how he'd promised himself he'd never put someone he loved through that experience. He told me about the day he'd gotten the test results, how he'd sat in his car in the hospital parking garage and cried for 2 hours before driving home and pretending everything was normal. I thought if I could just fade out gradually, he said, his voice hoarse from crying, you'd eventually decide you deserved better and leave on your own. Clean break. No guilt. No obligation to stay with someone whose best years were already behind him. By dawn, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months, clarity. I called in sick to work and spent the day alone while Michael was at his office, presumably having a normal Thursday while processing the fact that his secret was finally out. I sat at our kitchen table with Rebecca's folder spread in front of me, reading medical articles about Huntington's disease and staring at the legal documents that proved my husband had been planning to abandon me. The betrayal was almost worse than the diagnosis. Almost. I could understand why he'd been afraid to tell me about the disease. It was terrifying, overwhelming, the kind of news that changes everything forever. But planning to divorce me? Researching how to leave me without explanation? That wasn't protection. That was cowardice. By the time Michael came home that evening, I had made a decision that surprised even me. We need to talk, I said, gesturing for him to sit across from me at the table where we'd had our confrontation the night before. He sat down carefully, like he was approaching a dangerous animal. Okay. I've been thinking about what you said. About not wanting this to be my life. I pulled out the legal documents Rebecca had found. And I've been thinking about these. About the fact that instead of trusting me with the truth, you decided to plan an escape route. Michael's face crumpled. Linda, please. I'm not done. My voice was steadier than I felt. You know what the cruelest part is? It's not the disease. It's not even the lying, although that hurt more than I can explain. The cruelest part is that you robbed me of the chance to choose you. You made the decision about our marriage without me, like I was a child who couldn't handle adult problems. I was trying to protect you. No, you were trying to protect yourself. From my reaction, from the possibility that I might choose to stay and love you through something difficult, from having to be vulnerable with the person who's supposed to be your partner. I spread the documents out between us. These papers? This research about divorce proceedings? This is what protection looks like to you. Planning to abandon your wife rather than trust her with the truth. Michael stared at the papers like they were evidence of a crime. Which, in a way, they were. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, and my voice had taken on a tone I'd never used before. Firm. Uncompromising. You have 2 choices. You can follow through with your plan to push me away until I leave, in which case I'll save you the trouble and file for divorce myself tomorrow. Or you can decide to trust me finally, with the whole truth about what we're dealing with. I want to trust you, he said quietly. Wanting isn't enough anymore, Michael. You need to prove it. And here's how you're going to do it. I pulled out a piece of paper where I'd written a list during my day alone. First, you're going to call Dr. Hendricks and tell him I need to be included in all your medical conversations from now on. Not as a visitor, not as someone you update when you feel like it. As your partner in managing this condition. Michael nodded, though he looked terrified. Second, you're going to start couples therapy with me. Because we need to learn how to communicate like married people instead of strangers, and we need professional help to figure out how to rebuild trust after months of deception. Okay. Third, you're never going to make another major decision about our life, our future, or your health without discussing it with me first. No more protecting me from difficult conversations. No more deciding what I can and cannot handle. We're partners, or we're nothing. Michael was crying again, but he was also nodding. Yes. Okay. All of that, yes. I leaned back in my chair and studied my husband's face. He looked younger somehow, like confessing had lifted years of weight off his shoulders. But he also looked fragile, uncertain, like he didn't quite believe I was really staying. There's one more thing, I said. He waited. You're going to tell me you love me every day and mean it. Not the distracted, love you babe, you've been giving me for months. Real love. The kind where you look at me like you're grateful I exist. Because Michael, if we're going to do this, if we're going to face something this big together, I need to know that you still see me as your wife, not as an obligation or a burden. I do love you, he said, and for the first time in months, his voice carried real emotion. I love you so much that the thought of watching you watch me disappear was unbearable. I love you so much that I was willing to break your heart to spare mine. That's not love, I said quietly. That's selfishness. Love is trusting someone enough to let them choose you, even when choosing you is difficult. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences that had filled our marriage over the past months. This one felt like possibility instead of ending. I want to choose you, I said finally. Every day, for as long as we have together. But I need you to let me make that choice instead of making it for me. Michael reached across the table and took my hands in his. His fingers were shaking, whether from emotion or early symptoms, I couldn't tell and didn't care. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry for all of it. For lying, for planning to leave, for wasting months when we could have been facing this together. I'm sorry too, I said, and meant it. I'm sorry you were so scared that you thought lying was better than trusting me. I'm sorry it took hiring a private investigator for us to have an honest conversation. And I'm sorry we're dealing with this at all. We sat there holding hands across our kitchen table, crying together for the first time since our wedding day. But this time, the tears felt like a beginning instead of an ending. The revenge I'd planned during my angry afternoon, leaving him, exposing his lies to his family, making him face the consequences of his deception alone, had transformed into something else entirely. Something that felt more like redemption. I wasn't the same woman who'd walked down the aisle in that vineyard 8 months earlier, trusting blindly and expecting fairy tale perfection. I was someone harder, more realistic, more demanding. Someone who understood that love without honesty was just mutual delusion, and that marriage without partnership was just two people sharing living expenses. But I was also someone who had chosen to stay. Not out of obligation or fear, but because I finally understood what my husband was facing, and I wanted to face it with him. What happens now? Michael asked. Now we start over, I said. But this time, we do it right. What would you have done in my shoes? Walk away or try to rebuild with strict boundaries? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to read your perspective. And if this story is resonating with you, subscribing really means the world to me. Sharing these deeply personal experiences isn't easy, but knowing you're listening makes it worthwhile. 2 years later, I'm writing this story from our new apartment in Queens, a ground floor unit with wider doorways and grab bars in the bathroom. Michael's condition has progressed, though slowly. His handwriting isn't as neat as it used to be, and sometimes he needs a moment to find the right word in conversation. But he's still working, still laughing at my terrible jokes, still very much the man I married. The difference is that now we face everything together. We started couples therapy 3 weeks after our kitchen table confrontation. Dr. Sandra became our guide through the complicated process of rebuilding a marriage that had nearly imploded under the weight of fear and deception. Michael learned how to communicate his anxieties instead of making unilateral decisions based on them. I learned how to ask for what I needed instead of hoping he'd figure it out through hints and silent suffering. It wasn't easy. There were weeks when Michael would slip back into his protective mode, trying to handle symptoms or medical appointments alone. There were days when I resented being thrust into the role of caregiver so young, when I looked at other couples our age planning babies and vacations and felt jealous of their uncomplicated futures. But there were also moments of profound intimacy that I'd never experienced in the early days of our relationship. Moments when Michael would trust me with his darkest fears about losing his independence, and I'd trust him with my terror about losing him. We learned to have conversations about death and disability and financial planning that most couples avoid until they're much older. We learned to be honest about everything. Michael's family was devastated when we finally told them about his diagnosis. His mother cried for days, blaming herself for not recognizing the signs earlier. His sister flew in from California to research treatment options and support groups. But they were also relieved to finally understand why Michael had been so distant, why family gatherings had become strained and awkward. My own family struggled more with the deception than the disease itself. "How could you not tell us you were going through this alone?" my mother asked, and I didn't have a good answer. I'd been so focused on protecting Michael's secret that I'd isolated myself from the people who loved me most. We joined a Huntington's disease support group, which connected us with other couples navigating similar journeys. Hearing their stories, some tragic, some inspiring, all honest, helped us understand that we weren't alone in facing an uncertain future. It also helped us appreciate that we still had time, still had each other, still had the possibility of years of meaningful life together. The physical intimacy that had been the source of so much pain in our early marriage gradually returned, though it looked different than I'd expected. It became more intentional, more precious, more about connection than performance. Michael's fear of his changing body gave way to acceptance, and my understanding of his struggles made every moment of closeness feel like a gift rather than an expectation. We started making different kinds of plans. Instead of dreaming about retirement and grandchildren, we focused on experiences we could have now. We took a trip to Ireland, where Michael's grandparents had been born. We spent a weekend learning to make pottery together, laughing as we created lopsided bowls and crooked vases. We adopted a rescue dog named Charlie, who seems to sense when Michael's having a difficult day and positions himself as a living, breathing comfort. I won't pretend it's been a fairy tale. Michael's mood swings, a common symptom of Huntington's, sometimes make him snappy or withdrawn. The knowledge that his condition will continue to progress hangs over every decision we make. The financial planning for future care needs is sobering and scary. Some days, the weight of it all feels overwhelming. But I also won't pretend I regret staying. The woman I am now, stronger, more honest, more intentional about love, is someone I respect more than the naive bride who thought marriage was supposed to be easy. The marriage we have now, built on truth instead of fantasy, feels more real and more valuable than the perfect facade we tried to maintain in those early months. Michael often apologizes for ruining my life, especially on his harder days. But the truth is, he didn't ruin my life. He complicated it, deepened it, made it more meaningful than I'd ever imagined it could be. I learned that love isn't just the euphoric feeling you have during wedding ceremonies. It's the choice you make every day to show up for someone, even when showing up is difficult. I learned that partnership isn't just sharing good times and splitting household chores. It's trusting someone with your worst fears and biggest failures and letting them trust you with theirs. Most importantly, I learned that honesty, even painful honesty, is the foundation of any relationship worth having. The months of deception nearly destroyed us, not because Michael was facing a terrible diagnosis, but because he chose to face it alone rather than trust me to face it with him. If you're in a relationship where someone is keeping secrets to protect you, I want you to know that protection without honesty isn't protection at all. It's control. You deserve to make informed decisions about your own life, even when those decisions are difficult. You deserve a partner who trusts you with the truth, even when the truth is scary. If you're someone who's hiding something significant from a person you love, I understand the impulse to protect them from pain. But consider that you might be protecting yourself more than you're protecting them. Consider that they might be stronger and more loving than you're giving them credit for. Consider that the secret itself might be causing more damage than the truth ever could. Michael and I don't know how our story ends. We don't know if we'll have 5 more years together or 15. We don't know what symptoms will develop or how quickly his condition will progress. But we know we'll face whatever comes together, with honesty and intention, and the kind of love that chooses to stay even when staying is hard. That's not the happy ending I expected when I walked down that aisle in the vineyard, but it's the real ending. And real, I've learned, is better than perfect every time. Stories like this remind us that the truth always comes out, and sometimes the most powerful response isn't dramatic revenge. It's taking your power back through honesty and choice. Love isn't just a feeling, it's a decision you make every single day, especially when that decision gets harder. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the relationships in your own life, please take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your engagement helps me continue sharing these real, complicated, Deeply human stories that remind us we're not alone in our struggles. And remember, whether you're facing a health crisis, a relationship challenge, or just the ordinary complications of building a life with another person, you don't have to face it alone. Trust the people who love you with your truth. You might be surprised by their capacity to love you through anything. Thank you for listening to my story. I'll see you in the next one.